Montana Territory, late autumn of 1887. The Bitterroot Valley was already turning gray with the promise of winter when Sarah Hendrick first noticed the cold creeping up through the floorboards of her cabin. From the outside, her home looked no different from the others scattered along Elk Creek. It was a modest structure made of rough-hewn logs, sealed with clay and moss, with a stone chimney that leaned slightly from years of hard wind. Smoke rose from it each morning and evening, just like every other homestead preparing for the long freeze. Nothing about it suggested that beneath its simple wooden floor, a quiet revolution in survival was taking shape. Sarah was a widow with 2 young children, Emma, 6, and Daniel, barely 4. She had moved into the abandoned cabin the previous October, determined to make a life for her family despite the hardships. The cabin was small, 16 feet square, sturdy enough, but by early November she realized something was wrong. No matter how much wood she burned, the warmth never lasted. Frost formed on the iron nails poking through the floorboards. The air felt thin and sharp. Her daughter developed a cough that wouldn't ease, and her son began waking in the night complaining that his feet hurt from the cold. She would rise before dawn, wrap herself in a shawl, and coax the stove back to life. The cast-iron box stove weighed nearly 200 pounds and should have been sufficient for a cabin of that size. She fed it split lodgepole pine in steady intervals, watching the flames dance behind the small metal door. Yet by evening, the cold returned as if it had been waiting just outside the walls, ready to reclaim the space the moment her back was turned. The heat rose quickly to the ceiling, escaping through gaps in the roof, while icy drafts swirled beneath the floor. It was as if the cabin itself refused to hold warmth. Her nearest neighbor, Bill Calhoun, burned even more wood and complained constantly of frozen floors and sleepless nights. He had built his cabin the proper way, raised off the ground for airflow, with a tall chimney to improve draft. He prided himself on doing things as other men had always done them. Yet his children slept in layers of clothing, and his wife kept kettles boiling simply to add moisture to the dry, biting air. Sarah watched and listened. She was not a builder by trade, but she had once been a schoolteacher in Pennsylvania. She had read books. She had studied basic science. And she remembered something important. The earth, below the frost line, held a steady temperature all year long. It was not warm in the way of a roaring fire, but it was stable. It did not swing wildly between extremes. It resisted the cold point. One morning, kneeling by the stove, she pressed her palm flat against the wooden floor. It felt like touching stone in shadow. She realized the problem was not the stove. It was not the wood. It was the empty crawl space beneath her cabin, acting like a tunnel for frigid air. The wind moved freely under her floorboards, stealing heat faster than she could create it. If she could stop that theft, perhaps she wouldn't need to burn so much wood. The idea came slowly at first. What if the space beneath the cabin wasn't left empty? What if it could be turned into something useful? She thought of root cellars from her childhood, dug deep into the ground where potatoes and carrots stayed cool in summer and safe from freezing in winter. Those cellars relied on the earth's steady temperature. The deeper you went, the more stable it became. She did not announce her plan to anyone. She did not seek permission or advice. She simply began. One cold November morning, after feeding the children and banking the stove, she pried up 2 floorboards near the center of the cabin. Beneath them was the shallow crawl space, barely 18 inches high. Dirt floor. Dry. Undisturbed. She lay flat on her stomach and pushed herself inside with a short-handled spade and a tin bucket. She dug slowly. Carefully. 1 bucket of soil at a time. Each load she hauled up through the opening and carried to the woods behind the cabin, scattering it where it would not draw attention. It was exhausting work. Her hands blistered. Her shoulders burned. But she kept going. By the end of the first week, she had carved out a pit roughly 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 3 feet deep. The air down there felt different. Not warm, but not biting either. It held a stillness that the wind above could not disturb. She kept digging. When she reached over 4 feet deep, she noticed something remarkable. The soil temperature felt steady to the touch. It did not carry the sharp sting of surface frost. It was calm, resistant to the cold pressing down from above. She sat in that space for a moment, dirt beneath her fingernails, and knew she was on the right path. Next came the stones. For 2 days, she hauled flat pieces of granite and schist from the nearby creek bed. They were heavy and awkward, and more than once she slipped on ice and bruised her shins. But she carried them back one by one. Inside the chamber, she stacked them tightly against the earthen walls, creating a thick lining. She used no mortar, just careful placement, fitting each stone snugly like pieces of a puzzle. Stone, she knew, absorbed heat slowly. But once warm, it held that heat and released it gradually. Like a cast iron pan removed from flame, it stayed hot long after the fire died down. If she could warm the stones, they would radiate heat back into the cabin for hours. She spread sand along the bottom for drainage and left the earth floor bare. Then she turned her attention to airflow. Near the stove, she cut a small square opening in the floor and fashioned a crude tin duct that angled downward into the chamber. Warm air from the stove would spill into the chamber instead of rising uselessly to the ceiling. On the opposite end, she cut a second vent, covered with cloth to keep out rodents. This would allow cooler air to circulate back toward the stove. A simple convection loop. Warm air would descend, heat the stones, and cooler air would return to be reheated. The chamber would become a thermal battery beneath her feet. When she finally replaced the floorboards and covered the trapdoor with a rug and bed frame, the cabin looked unchanged. Only Sarah knew what lay beneath. Neighbors noticed her hauling stones and dirt, building something. Bill Calhoun asked casually one afternoon, improving the foundation. She replied. They chuckled quietly at the store in Stevensville. A woman digging under her own house. It sounded foolish. Dangerous. Unnecessary. Winter arrived before the talk faded. By January 1888, the temperature plunged to levels few had seen. 12 degrees. 0. Then 15 below. The wind followed, driving snow sideways across the valley. For 11 straight days, it never rose above 20 below 0. Cabins groaned under the strain. Chimneys choked with ice. Families burned through wood piles meant to last the entire season. Bill Calhoun went through 2 full cords in less than a week. His children slept in coats. Frost crept along his floorboards like lace. Eugene Cross, the trapper, ran out of dry wood and began breaking up furniture. Mary Watts burned damp logs and filled her cabin with smoke just to keep from freezing. When Dr. Raymond Kellerman finally made his rounds after the storm broke, he entered Sarah's cabin expecting the worst. Instead, he found comfort. He pulled out his pocket thermometer. 58 degrees. He walked to the far corner away from the stove. 56. He crouched and pressed his hand to the floor, warm, not blazing, but gently radiating. How? He asked. She moved the bed aside and lifted the rug. The trapdoor creaked open, revealing the stone-lined chamber below. The air rising from it carried stored warmth, days of quiet heat absorbed and slowly released. How much would have you burned? He asked. Half a cord, she answered. He did the math. Her neighbors had burned nearly 3 times that amount and still suffered freezing interiors. Word spread quickly. The same neighbors who had dismissed her now asked to see the chamber. They knelt beside the trapdoor, feeling the warmth rising from below, examining the stones, studying the vents. "It's a heat battery," Bill Calhoun muttered. Sarah simply nodded. "By spring, others began digging beneath their cabins. They modified the design. Some dug deeper. Some used river rock instead of flat stone. But the principle remained the same. Use the Earth's steady temperature and stone's thermal mass to stabilize heat. By the following winter, cabins equipped with underground chambers reported using significantly less wood while staying noticeably warmer. Floors no longer frosted over. Children slept without waking from cold. The technique spread quietly, not through formal instruction but through observation and need. Sarah never sought recognition. She did not name the design after herself. She did not boast. She simply prepared for the next winter as she always had, tending her stove, teaching her children, and trusting the quiet science beneath her feet. The lesson was not about inventing something new. Thermal mass had existed for centuries. Root cellars, stone houses, earth shelters, all relied on the same principles. What Sarah had done was apply old knowledge in a new context, where it mattered most. She had paid attention. She had refused to accept cold floors as inevitable, and when the blizzard came, the numbers spoke louder than opinion. 58 degrees on half a cord of wood. Physics does not argue. It simply works. Long after the winter of 1888 passed into memory, variations of underground thermal chambers appeared throughout western Montana and northern Idaho. Builders incorporated below-floor mass as common sense in cold climates. What had once been mocked became practical wisdom, but beneath Sarah's cabin, the original chamber remained. Stone stacked by blistered hands. Earth shaped by quiet determination. A hidden room that turned survival into certainty, and every winter after, when snow piled high against the north wall and wind rattled the shutters, warmth rose steadily from below, a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in burning brighter, but in holding heat long enough to endure. The winter after the great blizzard did not arrive with the same violence, but it came with memory. In the Bitterroot Valley, memory mattered almost as much as weather. People remembered who had shared food, who had borrowed too much and returned too little, who had prepared wisely and who had gambled with luck. And they remembered who had stayed warm when others had not. By late summer of 1888, the valley had changed in subtle ways. Not in appearance. The cabins still leaned against the wind, the river still ran cold and clear, and the pine forest still whispered in the evenings, but in attitude. There was a quiet shift in how people spoke about heat, about building, about what was proper, and what simply worked. Sarah Hendrick did not ask for that shift. It followed her anyway. Men who had once chuckled at the sight of her hauling stone now stopped by with questions. Some tried to hide their curiosity behind casual conversation. Others were direct. "How deep did you say you dug? Did you line the whole thing with rock? Any trouble with damp?" Sarah answered each question plainly. She showed them the trapdoor without ceremony. She explained how the warm air fell through the duct and how the cooler air returned toward the stove. She described how the stone absorbed heat over hours and released it slowly through the night. She did not use complicated language. She used observation. "The earth doesn't change its mind," she would say. "It stays steady. So I let it help." That autumn, 5 cabins along Elk Creek dug chambers of their own. Bill Calhoun led the effort, swallowing his pride without making a show of it. He adjusted his design slightly, digging deeper and lining the space with thicker stone. He added a small clean-out access so he could monitor moisture. When the first frost came, He noticed immediately that his floors felt different, warmer, not dramatically so at first, but enough to notice. Eugene Cross built his chamber under the center of his cabin, reinforcing the beams with extra posts, determined not to risk collapse. He had lost 2 fingers to frostbite the previous winter and did not intend to gamble again. Mary Watts hesitated longer. Living alone, the digging would be harder. But Sarah offered help. On crisp October mornings, the 2 women worked side by side, prying boards, hauling soil, stacking stone. It was slow, heavy labor, but it carried purpose. As more cabins adopted the design, small improvements began to appear. One homesteader experimented with clay plaster between the stones to improve stability. Another added an adjustable vent near the ceiling to control airflow. A rancher over the ridge built a larger chamber beneath his barn, preventing livestock water from freezing even during cold snaps. The valley began to treat heat as something to be managed, not simply fought. Winter 1889 arrived cold but not catastrophic. Temperatures dipped below zero several times, and snow piled deep against north-facing walls. But something was different. Chimneys did not roar as constantly. Woodpiles lasted longer. The sharp smell of smoke that once hung over the valley during freezes was lighter, thinner. Dr. Kellerman noticed it first during his house calls. He found fewer cases of frostbite. Fewer children coughing from damp cold. Cabins that once hovered barely above freezing now held steady in the mid-40s or low 50s. Not luxurious, but survivable. Stable. He began keeping notes, not for publication. There was no formal journal for such things, but for record. He sketched rough diagrams of different chamber variations. He compared wood usage from previous winters. The reduction averaged near 30%. 30% less wood meant fewer hours chopping in snow. Fewer dangerous trips into the forest during storms. Fewer accidents. It meant margin, and margin meant survival. By the early 1890s, word of the underground chambers spread beyond Elk Creek. Travelers passing through Stevensville carried stories east and west. A miner heading toward Idaho mentioned the design to a boarding house owner. A trader described it to settlers in northern Montana. No one credited a formal inventor. It was simply that stone chamber under the floor some folks down in Bitterroot use. Sarah continued her quiet routine. She taught Emma to read by lantern light and showed Daniel how to split kindling safely. She mended clothing, salted meat, tended a small kitchen garden each spring. Life did not become easy. It became steadier, but not everyone approved of the change. A carpenter from Missoula, passing through in 1891, scoffed openly at the idea when he heard about it at the store. "You undermine the ground under a structure, you invite trouble," he said. "Moisture, rot, settling. It's poor practice." Horace Finch, once skeptical himself, leaned against the counter and replied, "Maybe so. But I've yet to see one fail. And I've seen fewer folks freezing." The carpenter shrugged. Tradition held strong in many places. Raised floors and airflow had long been considered essential. To deliberately trap warmth beneath a cabin felt backward to some, yet results were hard to argue with. That winter brought another severe cold spell, not as prolonged as the Great Blizzard but sharp enough to test any design. For 6 consecutive nights, temperatures dropped below 15 below zero. Winds rattled shutters and drove snow under eaves. Cabins with chambers held steady, cabins without burned wood in frantic cycles. The difference was no longer subtle. A visiting surveyor, documenting homesteads for territorial records, stayed one evening at Sarah's cabin during the cold snap. He removed his gloves and sat near the stove, expecting the typical pattern: intense heat near the fire, icy drafts near the walls. Instead, he felt an evenness he had rarely experienced in frontier housing. He walked the perimeter of the room, boots thudding softly against the planks. No cold corners. No biting chill rising from below. "What have you done differently?" he asked. She showed him. He stared into the chamber with quiet fascination. "You've borrowed the earth's patience," he said. She smiled at that. By 1893, younger builders in the region began incorporating underground thermal mass intentionally during initial construction rather than retrofitting later. They dug partial basements, lined them with stone, and designed airflow channels from the beginning. Some even experimented with routing stovepipes through underground passages to capture more heat before venting smoke outside. Not all attempts were successful. One poorly shored chamber collapsed during heavy spring rains, teaching a hard lesson about drainage and reinforcement. Another cabin developed moisture problems because vents were improperly screened. Each failure added knowledge. Adjustments followed. Sarah observed these developments with interest but rarely interfered. When asked for advice, she emphasized simplicity: keep it dry. Keep it steady. Don't rush. Emma grew older and began helping more with maintenance. She kept a small notebook where she recorded outside temperatures and interior warmth, comparing wood usage week by week. Daniel learned to check the chamber walls for dampness and clear debris from vents. The hidden room beneath their cabin became part of daily life, no longer secret but still unseen by those who did not look for it. As years passed, the chamber proved durable. The stone did not crumble. The earth did not shift significantly. Each autumn, Sarah inspected the supports and reinforced where necessary. She added small wooden braces to strengthen overhead beams and replaced floorboards when they wore thin. The design matured. By the late 1890s, the Bitterroot Valley had endured multiple winters without losing a single family to exposure. That statistic mattered. It was spoken quietly at gatherings, acknowledged in passing conversation. Survival was no longer purely a matter of burning more wood. It was about storing heat wisely. Children who had once slept in layered coats now remembered milder nights. They grew stronger. Health improved incrementally. Less smoke inhalation meant fewer lingering coughs. Fewer frantic wood-cutting trips meant fewer injuries. A small shift in physics had created a large shift in life. One evening in early 1901, as snow drifted softly against the cabin walls, Emma, now a young woman, asked her mother why she had never told the story widely. "You could have claimed it," Emma said. "Named it. Sold the idea." Sarah stirred the stove gently and considered the question. "I didn't invent anything," she replied. "The earth was always there. The stone was always there. I just listened." Emma nodded, understanding more than she might have years earlier. In truth, Sarah knew the idea would have spread regardless. People learn from what works. Frontier communities, perhaps more than any others, adopt solutions that prove themselves in hardship. Pride bends when survival demands it. The hidden room beneath the cabin became less about innovation and more about perspective. It represented a shift from fighting the cold aggressively to cooperating with the environment intelligently. By 1903, travelers passing through the region remarked on how many cabins incorporated partial underground chambers. Some designs evolved into full basements with insulated walls. Others remained modest pits lined with stone. The principle persisted: thermal mass, convection, stability. The valley no longer mocked such ideas. Years later, long after Sarah's children had grown and built cabins of their own, a particularly harsh winter returned. It was not as legendary as the blizzard of 1888, but it tested every homestead again. Temperatures hovered below zero for extended stretches, and windstorms battered structures relentlessly. yet the community endured without panic. Wood supplies lasted. Interiors stayed livable. The once terrifying sound of wind against thin walls no longer carried the same dread. Beneath many cabins, stone chambers quietly radiated stored warmth. Sarah, older now, sat near her stove and listened to the storm. She could feel the steady heat rising from below, just as she had years ago. Her hands, once blistered from digging, now bore the marks of time instead. But the chamber remained strong. She thought about that first winter, about frost on nails and her children's aching feet. About neighbors' doubts and whispered laughter. About the long hours digging alone in dim light. The memory did not bring bitterness. It brought gratitude, because what had begun as desperation had become knowledge shared. What had started as a hidden room had reshaped a valley's understanding of warmth, and still, the principle was simple: heat does not need to roar to win. It needs to endure. Outside, the wind howled across the Bitterroot Valley, just as it had decades before. Snow swirled in white sheets, erasing the horizon. Cabins stood firm, smoke rising gently from chimneys. Beneath many of those floors, unseen and steady, stone held warmth like a quiet promise, and it all began when one woman decided that cold floors were not inevitable, that the earth beneath her feet might be an ally rather than an enemy, and that survival sometimes depends less on burning more, and more on understanding better. And as the years stretched on, the story of the hidden room beneath Sarah's cabin stopped being a story about a storm. It became a story about paying attention. About refusing to accept suffering as normal simply because it had always been that way. Long after the blizzard faded into memory, long after new families settled the valley and older ones moved on, the lesson remained buried just beneath the floorboards: wisdom does not always shout. Sometimes it waits quietly under your feet, steady and patient, until someone is brave enough to uncover it. On the coldest nights, when wind pressed hard against the logs and snow climbed the windowsills, warmth still rose from stone laid by blistered hands decades earlier. Children who had never known that terrible winter slept peacefully, unaware that their comfort was built on one woman's quiet determination. No monument marked the spot. No plaque told the story. But every steady breath taken inside those warm cabins was proof enough, because in the end, the secret room was never just about heat. It was about courage. It was about thinking differently when it mattered most. And it was about understanding that sometimes survival doesn't belong to the strongest fire, it belongs to the one who learns how to make the warmth last.